Now recognize colleagues, I'm going to ask you to leave the room quietly because I have a question of privilege which is being raised by the honourable member for Thornhill. The honourable member.
Mr. Speaker, I'm rising on a question of privilege arising from some very disturbing events which occurred just outside this place over the weekend. On Saturday, the Parliamentary Protective Service, for which you are responsible for and provide policy direction to, imposed an ideological test for entry on the grounds of Parliament Hill. According to a video posted online, a visitor is seen being denied access because he was not, quote, not a supporter of Palestine and doesn't recognize a Palestinian state. The visitor, of course, was denied access to Parliament Hill for the sole reason that he didn't hold a political opinion considered acceptable to whoever approved this requirement for entry. And to my knowledge, that's the first time that access to Parliament has been subjected to a screening with political points of view, at least documented as such. Parliament is the beating heart of Canadian democracy, and it is where Canadians often come to exercise one of the most cherished constitutional rights guaranteed to them under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and freedom of expression. So to cherry-pick that point of view, as expressed on Parliament Hill, is simply not consistent with Canadian values. So now it should be made clear, though, that this is in no way directed at the officer, but the question, the policy direction that you, the Speaker, are responsible for. It should also be made clear that the very fact that anyone cannot access Parliament Hill because of an opinion they hold, or worse, they cannot be trusted to be in the same place as someone who holds an entirely different opinion, is a stain on the state of our country and the divisiveness that has been allowed to fester here. And it's a country that's seen hate crimes rise 250% since 2015, a country that has seen lawlessness and the mob rule our streets. Two groups of people who have opposing views cannot enter at the same time to express those views in one place. What has become of this country? Conservatives believe that Parliament Hill must be safe and secure while remaining open and accessible to all, including those peacefully protesting. All points of view from all Canadians should be heard. That is their constitutional right, regardless of whether they are politically fashionable amongst the elites. The litmus test about recognizing a Palestinian state as the key to enter, in fact, is also the position of the Government of Canada and many of the Canadian allies, so I'm not sure what that was all about. Had the Conservative members of Parliament sought to access the House of Commons, our place of work on Saturday would have been denied access because we would not or could not have satisfied that ideological test, even though members are free to access the parliamentary precinct, and that is a well-established privilege of Parliament. The House of Commons Procedure and Practice, the third edition, explains that on page 107 that, quote, in order to fulfill their parliamentary duties, members should be able to go about their parliamentary business undisturbed. And continuing on page 110, Boscan-Gagnon write, quote, incidents involving physical obstructions such as traffic barriers, security cordons, and union picket lines, either impeding members' access to the parliamentary precinct or blocking their free movement within the precinct, as well as occurrences of physical assault, have been found to be prima facie in a case of privilege. So, as also explained on paragraph 15 of the 66th report of the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs tabled in April of 1999, quote, one of the privileges of members of this House of Commons is the right to unimpeded access to Parliament and the parliamentary precincts. Members are entitled to go about their parliamentary business undisturbed. This privilege dates back to at least the early 18th century, and it is part of the heritage of all legislative bodies and trace their origins to the British parliamentary tradition. It is based on the preeminent right of the House to attendance and to the service of its members. Any obstruction of members constitutes a breach of privilege and the contempt of the House, end quote. The point was repeated in the same committee's 26th report tabled in May of 2012, quote, as a part of parliamentary privilege, members of this House of Commons have the right of unimpeded and unfettered access to the parliamentary precincts and are entitled to go about their parliamentary duties and functions undisturbed without any form of interference, end quote. Joseph Mango, makes the simple point that in his parliamentary privilege in Canada's second edition at page 176, that, quote, no impediment should be placed on the member in going about his parliamentary business, whether in the House or on the way to the House or while on his way home. Further down on the same page, he wrote, quote, since Parliament Hill has always been a public place, restricting the movement of the general public on grounds we would probably be considered excessive, end quote. To punctuate that point, he added a footnote, footnote 47, which reads, quote, there is little, if any, restriction on the grounds of Parliament Hill, even during the 1970 October crisis, end quote. Shortly following Pierre Trudeau's invocation of the War Measures Act, the former Standing Committee on Procedure and Organization recommended in its second report presented to this House in March 1971, quote, your committee believes that the main problem in connection with security on Parliament is to strike reasonable balance between the importance of allowing the public ready access to the House of Commons on one hand and the necessity of preserving the security of the House on the other. Your committee was governed at all times by the belief that Parliament should not be isolated from the people as a result of exaggerated security measures, and that it is important in a democratic society that members of Parliament should continue to have direct communications with the public. Consequently, your committee has conducted that whatever security measures are provided, it must be reasonable and consistent with the right of the public to come to Parliament. It's not easy to reconcile these two imperatives, but your committee feels that the balance should always be in favor of permitting the public reasonable and proper access to Parliament without intruding on in any obvious way on the undoubted rights of citizens to approach Parliament, end quote. That just sounds like common sense to me, Mr. Speaker. The Canadians who elect us have a right to come to Parliament and make their voices heard, and yet it seems that they've been chucked out the window in favor of a shocking news that ideological purity tests are now needed to access Parliament Hill, a very high impediment that is being imposed. And in short, the ideological test that Conservative MPs and some even Liberal MPs and many, many Canadians in this case would fail to pass, blocking politicians, especially opposition politicians, from accessing the legislature, which they were elected to plainly represent their constituents, is undemocratic and un-Canadian. And it's the sort of thing that dictatorships do, Mr. Speaker. So to be sure, Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to lay any blame on the constable who was seen in the video. Indeed, I don't hold any single frontline member of the service responsible. They would have simply been following directions decided much higher up. Conjuring up political ideological tests for accessing Parliament is not something you would expect any single constable to have simply freelanced. So it certainly comes from somewhere. Subsection 79.52 of Parliament of Canada Act explains that, quote, the Speaker and the Senate and of the Senate and the Speaker of the House are, as custodians of powers, of privileges, rights, and immunities for their respective House and of members of those Houses responsible for services, end quote. You, sir, are responsible for that service. And subsection 79.54 of the same Act adds, quote, the Director shall lead the integrated security operations throughout the parliamentary precinct and Parliament Hill under the joint general policy direction of the Speaker of the Senate and the Speaker of the House, end quote. And beyond the matter of any policy directions that you may or may not have given, it is important to understand that Section 79.55 of the Act vests responsibility for, quote, the physical security services throughout the parliamentary precinct of Parliament Hill, delivered by the PPS, the RCMP, and the RCMP. In fact, the Director of the PPS is required by subsection 79.56 of the Act to be a member of the RCMP. Subsection 5 of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Act makes quite clear that the Liberal Cabinet appoints the RCMP's top boss and the Commissioner, quote, who under the direction of the Minister has control and management of the force and all matters connected to the force, end quote. At the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, this boils down to one essential question. was the direction to require the Parliamentary Protective Service to apply a political litmus test to anyone seeking access to Parliament Hill this past weekend, a general policy direction which you approved, or was it the direction of the Minister of Public Safety in relation to his control of the RCMP, which is responsible for physical security of the Hill? No matter how you cut it, which Liberal made the decision of ideological tests of political points of view are shocking and unacceptable and an impediment to members of Parliament who must have free and ready access to the parliamentary precinct at all times, not to mention all Canadians that should be able to come on the Hill at all times on all issues. Should you agree, Mr. Speaker, that this is a prima facie case of privilege, I intend to move a motion to refer this matter to the Procedure and House Affairs Committee for investigation. By allowing for this issue to be studied in committee, it will allow for those key questions to be answered. Who gave the directive? Was it you, Mr. Speaker, or was it the Minister of Public Safety who approved this ideological test for Parliament Hill access, and whether ideological tests have been approved in Hill access before this time? These are very important issues. They are very important concerns, and Parliament stands for free speech in its very name. The grounds which surround our building ought to stand equally for free speech and not a safe speech bubble, or for some speech, or for acceptable speech, even worse, and reserved only for those opinions that are shared with the government or shared with elites or fashionable at the time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Hear, hear.
I thank the honourable member for her intervention. I see that the honourable member from New Westminster Burnaby is rising on his feet on the same matter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as our practice, I'm asking for consideration to review the blues and potentially come back in the next day or two on this issue.
And I see that the honourable member from Kingston and the Islands is also rising on a similar matter.
Likewise, Mr. Speaker, we would like the opportunity to review and come back to you in timely fashion. And I can assure all members, and especially the member from Thornhill who raised this question of privilege, that I look forward to getting back to the House as soon as possible once the other interventions are made.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary is rising on a point of order.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. I am rising to respond to the question of privilege raised by the member for Thornhill on October the 7th. I'll be extremely brief. We believe that all Canadians have a right to a peaceful protest. However, my intervention strictly deals with whether or not this matter constitutes a prima facie question of privilege. The member cites House of Commons Procedures and Practice, 3rd edition, to page 107, which states, and I quote, "In order to fulfill their parliamentary duties, members should be able to go about their parliamentary business undisturbed." The member also cited page 110, which states, and again I would quote, "Incidents involving physical obstruction, such as traffic barriers, security cordons, and union picket lines, either impeding members' access to the parliamentary precinct or blocking their free movement within the precinct, as well as occurrences of physical assault, have been found to be prima facie cases of privilege." Both of these citations refer to members being impeded because members have parliamentary privilege. The situation that the member describes does not involve members, and as such, this does not constitute a question of privilege. Thank you.